The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban street, the kind of day where everything seems still lawns perfectly trimmed, sprinklers ticking rhythmically, and the faint smell of fresh paint wafting from a newly renovated porch. Zeen, a tall black teenager in a loose basketball jersey and faded sneakers, leaned casually against the stone edge of the community fountain. He scrolled through his phone with the effortless cool of someone who belonged exactly where he was, and he did belong here. This was his neighborhood, his home. His friends lived in these houses, and his father, though most people didn't know, was the man who oversaw the entire community. But none of that mattered to the eyes now glaring at him from across the street. From the shade of a flowering dogwood tree came a sharp, piercing voice. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The words sliced through the calm afternoon, turning heads of a few neighbors watering plants or carrying groceries from their cars. Zeen looked up, startled, but not intimidated. Striding toward him was HOA Karen, a young woman with short, stiff, blonde hair that framed her face like a helmet. Her bright pink dress was tailored sharply, hugging her frame as if she dressed for confrontation. Matching pink heels clicked against the pavement, each step echoing her impatience and self-importance. She folded her arms across her chest, chin lifted, as if she owned not just her house but every square foot of the neighborhood. Zeen blinked at her, confused. "I live here. Why are you asking me that?" His tone was calm, but his brow furrowed. Already sensing where this was going, Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Don't play games with me. Teenagers like you hang around here causing trouble. Vandalism, noise, trash left behind. I've seen it all before." She gestured vaguely to the fountain, as though Zeen had committed a crime by simply leaning on it. Zeen straightened up, pocketing his phone. "You don't even know me. I'm not bothering anyone." Karen scoffed, tilting her head. "Don't bother lying. I've lived here long enough to know who belongs and who doesn't. And you?" Her eyes scanned him with open disdain. "Don't." The words carried a sharp edge, dripping with the unspoken prejudice behind them. Zeen felt heat rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain steady. He'd seen people like her before, people who looked at him and decided he was guilty of something before he even spoke. Karen didn't hesitate another second. She yanked her phone from her purse with a dramatic flourish. "I'm calling security. We'll let them sort it out." Zeen shook his head, almost amused. "Seriously, you're calling security on me for standing by a fountain?" Karen ignored him, pressing the phone to her ear. "Yes. Hello. There's a suspicious individual loitering near the community fountain." "Yes. He refuses to leave. I feel unsafe." She shot Zeen a triumphant glance, her lips curling into a smug smile. Zeen muttered under his breath, just loud enough for himself to hear. "You're about to regret this." The scene hadn't gone unnoticed. Curtains twitched in nearby windows. A mother pulling her toddler in a red wagon paused at the corner, frowning. An older man, watering his petunias, leaned on his hose, shaking his head slowly. Everyone knew Karen Young loud, always ready to call someone out, even if she was dead wrong. Still, no one dared interfere. They'd seen what happened to those who challenged her. Endless complaints, anonymous HOA fines, confrontations that dragged on for weeks. Better to stay out of her way. Zeen, however, wasn't just any target. He shifted his stance, his calm demeanor hiding the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. This wasn't going to end the way Karen thought. Karen snapped her phone shut after hanging up, satisfaction radiating from her like heat waves off the pavement. "Security will be here in minutes," she announced, loud enough for the onlookers to hear, "and when they arrive, you'll be escorted out. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to sneak in." Zeen chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Sneak in? I live here. This is literally my neighborhood." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, her short blonde hair bouncing slightly with the motion. "Sure you do. I've memorized every resident. In this community, believe me, I would have noticed you." Her words only deepened the crowd's curiosity. A teenage boy watching from his porch whispered to his sister, "Pretty sure he does live here." The sister shushed him, though her wide eyes stayed fixed on the unfolding standoff. Zeen folded his arms, mirroring Karen's posture but with less rigidity. "You know, for someone who claims to know everything about this place, you sure don't know much." Karen bristled, her pink dress catching the sunlight as though it was mocking her rising anger. "Watch your tone, young man. You're already in enough trouble." Zeen smirked, his calmness now clearly intentional. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't scared. He was waiting. The faint hum of wheels on pavement grew louder. The HOA security cart was on its way, turning the corner at the end of the street. Karen's smile widened, victory practically glowing in her eyes. She adjusted her dress, smoothed her hair, and prepared to play the hero in front of her neighbors. But Zeen just leaned back against the fountain again, completely relaxed. He knew something she did in single quotes T. And soon, the entire neighborhood was about to find out. Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, her voice grew sharper, slicing through the calm like a siren. She planted her heels into the pavement and raised her chin high, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "This is a private community," she barked, her words echoing off the rows of pastel-colored homes. "You can't just loiter here like you own the place. People like you need to follow the rules. Her words carried venom. Not just rules, but an accusation wrapped in prejudice. Zeen clenched his jaw, his muscles tightening under his jersey. People like me, he shot back, his voice low but steady. You don't even know who I am. Karen smirked, eyes glinting with a self-satisfaction that only fueled the scene further. She tapped her phone screen, checking for the arrival of security as though she were summoning backup in a battle she was certain she'd already won. Security is on the way, she declared triumphantly. You'll be out of here in minutes. Let's see you explain this to them. The street began to stir. A front door opened with a creak as an elderly couple stepped outside, clutching their iced teas, squinting at the sight of Karen, once again, in the spotlight. A teenager across the road set down his basketball, whispering to his younger sister. She's at it again. One older man, watering his flowers in a faded baseball cap, muttered under his breath, Karen again. He shook his head, sighing. Everyone knew this routine. The pink dress, the raised voice, the accusations. Karen lived for these little spectacles, always trying to prove she was the self-appointed sheriff of the neighborhood. But Zeen wasn't. Rattled, he wasn't like the others she had cornered before. He slipped his phone back into his pocket with deliberate calm, straightened his posture, and fixed his gaze on her. His expression was unreadable, calm, but edged with quiet strength. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice steady, like he wasn't the least bit worried about what was coming next. Karen rolled her eyes, her blonde bob bouncing slightly. With the motion, no, the mistake is you thinking you can disrespect our community. Her tone dripped with condescension, as if Zeen were a trespasser who had no business speaking back to her. The tension was rising. The silence of the neighborhood amplified every word, every look. The air itself seemed charged, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. A golf cart's buzzing hum broke through the silence. The sound grew louder as the HOA security vehicle rounded the corner, its wheels crunching against the asphalt. For Karen, it was music to her ears. She smiled smugly, her lips curling like a cat about to pounce on its prey. Victory was practically within her grasp. Finally, she muttered under her breath. She smoothed her pink dress with one hand, as though preparing for a performance. She wanted the entire neighborhood to see this. Karen, the vigilant guardian of the community, catching an intruder red-handed. Zeen didn't flinch. He didn't even move. Instead, he leaned slightly to one side, watching the approaching cart with an expression that almost looked amused. The neighbors sensed something different about this confrontation. Normally, Karen's targets sputtered excuses, argued back, or tried to flee. But this boy, this tall teenager in a basketball jersey, stood his ground with a quiet defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was something else. Something that unsettled even those who had grown accustomed to Karen's tirades. The golf cart slowed, squeaking to a stop near the fountain. The uniformed security officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, scanning the scene with practiced caution. Karen straightened her back, raising her arm dramatically to point at Zeen. There, she exclaimed, her voice dripping with false urgency. That's the one. He has been loitering, intimidating residents, and refusing to leave. I demand he be escorted out immediately. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some frowned, others shook their heads, but no one interrupted. They wanted to see how this would play out. Zeen didn't rush to defend himself. He stood tall, arms folded, eyes steady. Karen's smugness radiated like the heat off the pavement. She believed she had the upper hand, as always. With the officer on her side, she thought the case was closed before it even began. But Zeen's calmness spoke volumes. His quiet confidence was unsettling, almost taunting, and Karen didn't even realize the trap she was walking into. The officer stepped closer, looking from Karen to Zeen. Do you live here, son? He asked firmly. Karen answered before Zeen could open his mouth. Of course not. I've lived here long enough to know every family, and I would have noticed him. Trust me, he doesn't belong. But Zeen's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Because, while Karen believed she was seconds away from another so-called victory, the truth was about to crash down on her with the force of a tidal wave. The neighbors leaned forward, sensing the turn of events. The air felt thick with anticipation. Karen adjusted her dress once more, ready to relish her moment. She had no idea, absolutely no idea, that this wasn't going to be her win. Because Zeen wasn't just any teenager. He was someone far more important. And the revelation waiting just around the corner would flip Karen's smug grin into the most humiliating defeat of her life. The security cart pulled up fast, its brakes squealing as rubber scraped the asphalt. The sudden sound made everyone flinch, even Karen, though she quickly recovered and straightened her posture, as if she were the one in charge. The cart rolled to a stop beside the fountain, its engine still buzzing faintly from the driver's seat. Stepped Officer Daniels, clipboard in one hand, radio clipped to his shoulder, his uniform pressed stiff as if he had walked out of a training manual. He looked at Karen, then at Zeen, then back at the growing cluster of neighbors who had gathered at the edges of their driveways. His voice was firm, trained for authority, but also tired, like a man who had dealt with these suburban disputes far too many times. What's going on here? Karen seized her moment like an actress stepping into the spotlight. She darted forward eagerly, finger extended toward Zeen, as though she had caught him committing a crime in broad daylight. Her blonde hair caught, the sunlight, her pink dress almost glowing as she declared, "This boy doesn't belong here. He's trespassing, loitering, and intimidating residents. I want him removed immediately." The drama of her words hung heavy in the air. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy looks, shifting uncomfortably. Some muttered under their breath, others simply crossed their arms, silently judging whether this was another one of Karen's overreactions. Zeen, however, didn't move an inch. His arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression flat, his tone calm. "Really? That's your story," he said, his words cutting through Karen's accusation like a knife. Officer Daniels frowned, looking between the two. His training told him to keep the peace, but something about Zeen's steady presence made him hesitate before acting. He cleared his throat, adjusting his clipboard. "Do you live here, son?" he asked, his voice probing but not hostile. "Yes," Zeen replied without a shred of hesitation. His gaze didn't flicker, his voice didn't waver. "Unit 47. For a moment, there was silence. Then Karen burst out laughing, the sound sharp and mocking. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand as though brushing away an absurd claim. "That's impossible. I know who lives there, and it's definitely not him. Don't try lying. It'll only make things worse for you." The crowd murmured again, a ripple of unease spreading through the neighbors. A boy whispered to his mother, "Isn't Unit 47 the big house near the clubhouse?" The mother shushed him quickly, but her eyes stayed locked on Zeen. Even Officer Daniels seemed to falter, tapping his pen against the clipboard, unsure whether to press further or wait for Karen to finish her tirade. Then, before anyone could speak again, the low purr of an engine rolled into the street. Heads turned as a sleek black car turned the corner, gliding smoothly toward the fountain. Its polished surface reflected the sun. The kind of vehicle that didn't just drive it announced its presence. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Whoever was arriving wasn't just another resident. This was someone important. The car slowed to a halt beside the fountain, its engine cutting off with a quiet finality. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall, commanding man in a charcoal gray suit. His shoes shined, his tie crisp, his presence so sharp it seemed to draw all the air out of the street. His stride was measured, powerful, each step echoing authority. The moment he appeared, the neighbors straightened, whispers rushing through the crowd like wind through leaves. Everyone knew who he was. Mr. Johnson, the HOA President himself? Karen blinked in shock. The smirk that had danced on her face moments ago flickered, then faded altogether. Her posture stiffened, her bravado faltering as she realized who had just arrived. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him. Mr. Johnson's eyes scanned the scene with the practiced sharpness of a leader who was used to walking into conflict. His gaze landed first on Officer Daniels, then on the crowd, and finally on Karen, who suddenly looked far smaller in her bright pink dress than she had moments before. His voice, deep and commanding, cut through the tension like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" The air stilled. Even the birds seemed to pause their chirping. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her confidence slipping but not completely gone. She tried to recover, plastering on a polite smile, her tone laced with faux concern. "Yes, sir. Thank goodness you're here. This boy is trespassing. I was just handling it before things got out of control." Her words stumbled slightly at the end, betraying the first hint of fear. The crowd wasn't buying her act anymore, and neither was the man standing before her. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he studied Zeen, who remained calm and collected. Finally, he spoke, his tone heavy with deliberate weight. "That boy?" He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build until Karen's forced smile twitched nervously. Then he finished, his voice ringing with finality. "Is my son." The words landed like thunder. The crowd gasped, the sound rippling outward in waves. A woman covered her mouth in shock. The teenager with the basketball nearly dropped it. Even Officer Daniels straightened eyes wide, clipboard forgotten at his side. Karen froze. Her entire face drained of color, her lips parted as though she had been physically struck. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her carefully built facade of authority crumbled in an instant. And in that silence, as the weight of Mr. Johnson's revelation hung heavy in the air, the neighborhood realized they weren't witnessing just another one of Karen's petty confrontations. They were witnessing her downfall. The silence was deafening. It stretched across the street like a heavy blanket, pressing down on everyone who stood watching. The sound of sprinklers clicking in the distance suddenly seemed absurdly loud compared to the shock that had just settled over the crowd. Karen's face drained of color, her lips parting slightly as the weight of Mr. Johnson's words sank in. Her eyes flicked from him to Zeen, and back again, as though her mind was scrambling for an explanation that didn't exist. "Your son?" she stammered, her voice shaky, stripped of the arrogance it had carried only moments earlier. The confident smirk, the raised chin, the certainty that she had been right, all of it, vanished in an instant. She stood rooted to the pavement, her entire demeanor collapsing like a stage set, suddenly revealed to be fake. Mr. Johnson didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the concrete as he closed the distance between himself and his son. Resting a firm hand on Zeen's shoulder, He looked around the gathering crowd before locking eyes with Karen. His voice came out steady, deep, and final. Yes, this is Zeen, my son. He has lived here since the day I moved in. And let me make something perfectly clear, he belongs here more than anyone questioning him. The words carried the weight of authority, the kind that left no room for debate. Murmurs erupted instantly among the neighbors. Some nodded, their faces filled with agreement and even relief. Others leaned toward each other, whispering with wide-eyed disbelief, as if they had just watched the plot twist of a movie unfold right in front of them. Zeen finally broke his composure. For so long, he had held himself steady, calm, and unbothered, but now, a smirk tugged at his lips. He let his calm exterior melt into a grin, turning slightly toward Karen, as if to savor the moment. Told you, you'd regret it, he said, his voice carrying a mix of satisfaction and restraint. It wasn't boastful, it was a quiet reminder that he had given her every chance to back down. Karen's eyes darted around nervously, seeking an escape, a lifeline, anything to undo the humiliation building around her. She fiddled with the hem of her pink dress. The bold color that once seemed to amplify her presence now felt like a spotlight mocking her. I didn't know, she stuttered. Her words were fragile, barely holding together under the weight of her unraveling authority. I just thought you thought wrong. Mr. Johnson cut her off sharply, his tone cold and precise. The crowd quieted instantly, his authority demanding silence. And worse, you acted on those thoughts. You've embarrassed yourself in front of this entire community. Let me be crystal clear. Prejudice and harassment will not be tolerated here, not from anyone. The murmurs swelled again, this time tinged with agreement. A woman near the corner folded her arms and muttered, "About time someone said it." Another man leaned to his wife, whispering. She finally picked the wrong target. Officer Daniels, who had been standing stiffly, watching the confrontation play out, finally exhaled and shook his head. Sliding his clipboard under his arm, he spoke with a faint note of irritation. Well, it seems like there's no issue, after all, except, he added pointedly, glancing at Karen, the one you created. That simple statement landed heavier than anyone expected. Karen flinched, her posture faltering even more. The officer's words made it official. She wasn't the hero she imagined herself to be. She was the problem. Karen instinctively took a step back, her heels clicking awkwardly against the pavement. The afternoon sun caught her pink dress, making it gleam against her pale face as if mocking the contrast between her flashy appearance and her crumbling dignity. The boldness that had once made her look powerful now only made her look out of place, small, and foolish. The neighbors didn't rush to her defense. They didn't clap or cheer for her like she might have once hoped. Instead, they stood in quiet judgment, watching her unravel. Some shook their heads, others whispered, and a few even smirked, enjoying the sight of Karen finally being humbled. Zeen stood tall beside his father, his confidence restored tenfold. The smirk on his face softened into a small smile of triumph. But he didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken louder than anything he could say. His calmness, his refusal to lose his temper, had made the contrast with Karen's outburst even sharper. Mr. Johnson, still standing firmly with his hand on his son's shoulder, gave one last piercing look at Karen. His words, though quieter, now carried the finality of a gavel striking down. I suggest you think twice before you ever pull something like this again. Our community deserves better than this circus you've created today. Karen's lips trembled. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. For once, she had nothing to say, and that silence was louder than all her shouting had ever been. The pink dress shimmered again in the sunlight, but now it didn't look bold or strong. It looked like a costume worn by someone who had been exposed, someone who wasn't nearly as powerful as she thought. And as she stood there, shrinking under the stares of her neighbors, Karen realized she hadn't just lost an argument. She had lost the respect of the entire community. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to salvage the last shreds of her dignity. Her tone was softer now, no longer sharp and commanding, but fragile and unsteady. I was only protecting the community, she whispered, though the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. Mr. Johnson didn't soften. His glare cut through her like a knife, his deep voice carrying a weight that silenced even the murmurs around them. From my son? From a teenager who was standing here, doing nothing wrong? You're not protecting anyone, Karen. You're dividing this neighborhood with your arrogance. His words were firm, measured, but they rang out like a verdict. Neighbors who had been watching, once hesitant to speak up, now found their voices. She's always doing this, one woman muttered, shaking her head in disapproval. The comments spread like wildfire, emboldening others. About time someone put her in her place, another added, louder this time. A few people even crossed their arms, nodding in agreement, as though finally free to admit what they'd been thinking all along. Karen's eyes widened. She had always believed she represented the silent majority of the neighborhood, that her voice was the voice of the community. But as the crowd shifted, she realized something she had never considered. Maybe they weren't on her side after all. Maybe they had just been tolerating her. Zeen stepped forward slightly, his calm demeanor an almost painful contrast to her unraveling. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His words landed with clarity, slicing through the air, sharper than any shout could. You called security on me because of how I look. You didn't care about the truth. You didn't ask questions. You didn't even stop to think. You just assumed. The accusation hung heavy between them. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her gaze dropped to the ground, and for the first time that afternoon, she couldn't look anyone in the eye. Her pink dress, once chosen to stand out and demand attention, no longer felt bold. It looked childish, almost ridiculous, under the weight of her humiliation. What had been her armor of confidence now clung to her like a reminder of how small she had become. Mr. Johnson straightened his tie, his every move radiating authority and finality. His voice was calm, but it carried the undeniable edge of leadership. This community deserves better than petty power plays and prejudice. And as HOA President, I will personally make sure this never happens again. His eyes lingered on Karen, unblinking, until she finally shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. The message was clear. Her reign of intimidation was over. The crowd responded with quiet murmurs of approval, some even clapping softly. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now openly expressed their relief. The shift in energy was undeniable, had been dethroned, and the balance of power had changed before everyone's eyes. Karen didn't argue. She didn't lash out or double down like she usually did. There was no clever retort or last-ditch attempt to win the crowd. The weight of her humiliation was too heavy, pressing down on her shoulders until her posture slumped. She turned away slowly, each step deliberate, as though she were walking through quicksand. Her head was lowered, strands of her short blonde hair falling into her face to shield her from the stares of the neighbors. The sting of embarrassment clung to her like a second skin as she walked away. Whispers trailed behind her. They weren't cruel, but they weren't sympathetic either. They were the voices of a community finally acknowledging the truth. Karen wasn't the protector she claimed to be. She was the problem. And now, everyone knew it. Zeen exhaled, the tension that had been building inside him finally releasing. He turned to his father with a small, triumphant smile. "Guess being your son has its perks," he said, his voice light but tinged with satisfaction. The crowd chuckled, the sound breaking the heaviness of the moment. Even Officer Daniels cracked a faint smile, shaking his head as though amused at how the entire scene had unfolded. The laughter wasn't loud, or mocking. It was the kind of collective release that comes when justice is finally served. For once, HOA Karen was silent. No arguments, no finger-pointing, no dramatic exits filled with shouting, just silence. A silence that said more than any words could. She had been exposed, and in front of the very people whose approval she had always craved. As the neighbors slowly dispersed, conversations buzzed in the air. But the focus was no longer on Karen. It was on Zeen, standing proudly beside his father. A reminder that respect isn't earned through intimidation or noise, it's earned through truth, dignity, and restraint. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the street. What had begun as yet another one of Karen's tirades had ended as a turning point for the entire neighborhood. And though the echoes of her humiliation would linger, one thing was certain: the days of HOA Karen running unchecked were over.